huge issue, and a subset of this huge issue, frankly, is how we learn what we learn, how we're figuring out what's going on. For example, the situation in Guatemala, what we don't know about this, and why that allows basically the kind of demagoguery that we've been getting out of Donald Trump. On the line with us is Professor Greg Grandin. He's a professor of history at New York University, a member of the Nation magazine's editorial board, the author of numerous books, including his latest out in March of this coming year. Professor, is this from last March or this coming up March?
No, this coming up March.
Okay, great. It's titled The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall. And an earlier book, The Last Colonial Massacre, details the nefarious history of the Border Patrol, particularly one of its founding agents, John Logan. TheNation.com is the website, and your Twitter handle is Greg Grandin, G-R-E-G-G-R-A-N-D-I-N. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So, what I read your piece, and I've, a few others that there's this young woman, Jacqueline, M.I. Rosary Calmanquin. She's a member of the Quechua people. Am I saying that right?
Quechua Maya.
Yeah. And that back in 1999, the UN Truth Commission said that there was 200,000 people killed out of her tribe. 8 out of 10 were indigenous.
Well, 200,000 over the course of the Guatemalan Civil War, maybe a little bit over 100,000 over a 2-year period of the Maya more broadly.
Right. So give us a sense of what was going on in Guatemala, and what was prompting it, what promoted this, and how and where are we at right now with it?
Yeah, well, as many of your listeners will know, this was the fallout of the 1954 CIA intervention in Guatemala, the overthrow of a democratically elected, basically a New Deal reformer trying to institute some social reforms, including land reform, and the CIA staged a coup. It was one of its first coups, a kind of full spectrum coup. The year before, they had intervened and overthrown Mossadegh in Iran, but that was a very quick operation. Guatemala was almost a year-long operation that drew on all of the different facets of American power, including psychological warfare, and the genocide in the early 1980s, late 1970s was part of the civil war that stemmed from that coup. Basically, the restoration of oligarchic power after 1954, and different waves of reformers trying to challenge that power that radicalized into an insurgency, a guerrilla war, and the response was this wholesale massacre. And one of the hardest hit places were where these 2 children were from, Jacqueline Calmanquin, but also Felipe Gomez, who also died in the custody of the Border Patrol just in December.
Mm-hmm.
The tragic deaths of these 2 Guatemalan children.
Yeah, and in fact, the 22 now, we have 22 immigrants who've died in ICE detention over the last 2 years. But,
yeah.
But specific to these Guatemalan children, these 2 kids, to what extent did this have anything to do with Ollie North and Ronald Reagan and the whole Contra thing?
Well, it has. In this
more Honduras,
has everything to do with it. IranContra was a consequential conspiracy on many levels. One, it was the new right, the conservative movement's effort to kind of reestablish the authority of the executive branch to wage unaccountable war after a whole set of restraints that were put in after Watergate, after Vietnam. IranContra was really just a workaround, a way that the executive branch, Ali North and all of those IranContra luminaries could raise money. And one way was to sell high-tech weaponry to revolutionary Iran and then divert the money to support the Contras in Nicaragua. It was specifically about Iran and Nicaragua, but it was really this larger restoration of the imperial presidency. And, the whole history, whole post-war history of, certainly post-Vietnam history of this effort to rein in U.S. foreign policy and hold it accountable and democratize foreign policy, and ongoing efforts to roll that democratization back. And that's what IranContra was about. And you just see the return of all of these people. John Bolton was was on the legal team of Reagan that tried to justify a lot of the actions that went into Iran-Contra, but there's no end to them. Dick Cheney, Oliver North. It's really the foreign policy establishment.
Wow. So to what extent is we see Guatemalan refugees coming, and Honduran and Salvadoran, and we know in El Salvador, I remember, John Negroponte went down there, and suddenly we started seeing people showing up with, their hands tied behind their backs and a bullet in the back of their head, which is very similar to what happened after he went to Iraq, as I recall. To what extent is U.S. foreign policy the driver of the so-called immigrant crisis or asylum seeker crisis that we have right now on our southern border? Is it 100%? Is it 130%?
Yeah,
Is it 70%?
It's foreign policy, it's economic policy, it's military policy, it's a drug war. Guatemala is a good lens, a tragic lens, but a good lens to understand the crisis in full. There's the coup that we talked about. There's the U.S. support for the Guatemalan military. There's the free trade policies that the U.S. pushed after, right before the end of the Cold War, which were devastating and have been devastating to peasant farmers. It makes, it destroys regional markets by flooding these economies with cheap corn, and so these farmers can't compete, but then there's no jobs to take. The U.S.'s promotion of biofuels, the transformation of all these peasant lands into plantations for African palm. Another factor is the U.S.'s drug war, Plan Colombia, which basically took the violence that was concentrated in the Andes around cocaine production and telegraphed it up through Central America and Mexico by diversifying the cartels. There's so many different dimensions in which the crisis in Guatemala that it's creating these waves of refugees is caused by U.S. policy. And Guatemala is just a microcosm of that. We could say the same thing about NAFTA. We could say the same thing about the drug war in Mexico. But one thumbnail way of thinking about it is if you look at Bill Clinton's 3 signature Latin American policies. One was NAFTA, second was Plan Colombia, and the third was the militarization of the border. All of those things kind of come together and create this social explosion, and that's kind of encapsulated and embodied in the death of these 2 children, as well as the other refugees and asylum seekers that you mentioned in ICE detention.
Right. We're talking with Professor Greg Grandin, a professor of history at New York University, a member of the Nation's editorial board. Your book, The Last Colonial Massacre, talks about the history of the Border Patrol. There's 2 different agencies that are dealing with these issues, I suppose. The Border Patrol at the border, and then ICE internal to the United States. What role are these agencies playing in I hate to call this a crisis, because I think Trump has created, a crisis for the United States. It's not a crisis. It's obviously a crisis for Guatemala and for the Guatemalans and the people fleeing the area. But, we could easily deal with these refugees, and we historically have.
It's semantics. So what exactly is the crisis?
So I lack a word to describe it, but maybe you've got one.
No, the catastrophe. We just call it the catastrophe.
There you go. Okay.
In total. The Border Patrol, one of the Last Colonial Massacre was really focused on Guatemala, but one of the things that it looked at was the way this, it wasn't really about the Border Patrol, but it did focus on somebody who was a former Border Patrol agent who in 1960, in late 1950s, joined the public safety program of the State Department, which was really just a front for the CIA. John Lungen, he started out in Oklahoma's sheriff's office, and he worked for the Border Patrol. He was involved in administering Operation Wetback, which was a mass deportation program of the Border Patrol. But then a lot of that knowledge that was developed in Operation Wetback was then exported internationally. He then went on to train security forces in a number of third world hotspots: Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Southeast Asia, Thailand in particular, and Guatemala. And one of the things that he did in Guatemala was basically put into place a modern death squad. And when I say a modern death squad, what I mean by that is is a paramilitary unit that is linked to the security apparatus of a country that's able to gather intelligence, process that intelligence, and act on it in a coordinated manner, rapid manner, that then gathers more intelligence. And
this is a U.S. Border Patrol agent.
yeah, you're a U.S. Border Patrol agent. I know. So
way down in Guatemala, in Central America.
We kind of have this impression of the Border Patrol as this sleepy backwater federal agency that might or might not be abusive at any particular moment and not really at the crux of the ideological struggles of the Cold War. But in fact, the Border Patrol, and as we're seeing in today's politics, the border is a central axis of American politics and police power, and that was also true in its role in developing and expanding the radius of paramilitary action.
Yeah, it's remarkable stuff. Greg, we're going to hit a hard break here in about 8 seconds. So, but thank you so much for the great work you're doing, and for highlighting these issues for us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Professor Greg Grandin, his upcoming book, it'll be out in March. I'm guessing you can probably pre-order it now, is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall. And Professor of History at New York University, his previous book, The Last Colonial Massacre, and he writes for The Nation magazine, thenation.com, and in fact, just some brilliant stuff. Greg, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yep, we'll be back.